Hello, people. How's it going? And continuing with my Bible study series, I haven't given up. I haven't stopped trying. A Bible study. See, to me, it's important to study the Bible, to study the Scriptures, to study the Bible like the early church did, and the early church fathers did. I'll explain what that is eventually. Um, I find studying the Bible interesting mainly because of how much it gets rewritten to the point where it no longer resembles what it originally said. Yeah, I'll get to that point too about all the translations, believe me. Because all those translations are part of the problem. But anyway, I think theology, if we call it theology, a Bible study, whatever wording you want to use, you're still studying the Bible. And I think a good, thorough understanding of the Bible, understanding of the early church and stuff, is to begin with the early church and those people who wrote things about the early church and for the early church and who fought for and against proper theology and who fought against the Gnostics, and I will talk about them too later at some point. Um, One of the very first books I ever read when I became a Christian, when I was one, I think. That's another story. I look, right now in my own spiritual life, I'm somewhere in the middle of trying to figure all this stuff out again. Because something went wrong with my Christian life, and I'm trying to figure out what went wrong. And it's partly, I think, why I'm doing this Bible study in the first place, this theological, whatever you want to call it, is I'm trying to regain something I remembered I had. And one of the very first books I ever read was the early Christian writings, the Penguin Classic, the revised translation here. The writings in this volume shed a glimmer of light in an otherwise dark period. It wasn't that dark. On the emerging traditions and organizations of the infant church. They are a selection of the group known as the Apostolic Fathers, so called because several of the authors were most likely disciples of the original apostles themselves. Like much of the New Testament, their writings take the form of letters and for the most part deal with practical problems of the life of the early church, as it struggles in the face of persecution to establish itself in the Roman world. They give us a picture of Christianity still drawing out on the theology and tradition of its parents' religion, Judaism. And I'll get into that problem too. Because believe me, the early church really spent a lot of effort trying to get rid of its roots, its core, and everything else, which is called Judaism. You cannot have Christianity without Judaism. Don't even try to convince me otherwise. I am a Jew. I will defend that to my dying day. You cannot have Christianity without Judaism. Where do you think the idea of the Messiah came from? Jesus was a Jew. He wasn't a Gentile. He didn't convert to anything. He wasn't this nebulous something that came out of nowhere. I'm done yelling. But anyway. I read, the first epistle of Clement of the Corinthians, dealing with the church with a lot of problems. Sort of like the Corinthians that the Apostle Paul had to deal with, basically. There was factions, and apparently the younger crowd threw out the older crowd, and it was a mess. But it's supposedly the Clement that's mentioned in the Bible by the Apostle Paul. Then there's the epistles of Ignatius to the Ephesians, the Magnesians, the Trallians, the Romans, the Philadelphians, the Samaritans, and to Polycarp. Yes, that Polycarp. The Epistle of Polycarp to the Philippians and the Martyrdom of Polycarp. The Epistle of Diognetus, the Epistle of Barnabas, supposedly written by the Barnabas and who traveled with Paul the first missionary journey. But it might have been. There's tradition that says it was. There's tradition that says it wasn't, of course. And then the Diacesis. The point of studying these early fathers, the point of studying anything about the Bible, is to figure out what the Bible is saying and what it means. That is why a Bible study is so important. You're trying to figure out, why do I believe in what I believe? Can I defend what I believe? It is all about apologetics. Apologetics is not apologizing for something. Apologetics means to defend what you believe. To defend it, to explain it, to stand up for it, anything other than to deny it. The early church fathers really were trying to figure out How is this thing? How is this organization known as the church going to function in the Roman world? Because they had a lot of issues to deal with. I mean, they were still struggling with the incarnation, with the Trinity, with salvation by grace and grace alone. They were, and the problem, part of the problem was, is they could not or would not stop trying to rip the Jewishness out of the scriptures. Once you rip Judaism out of the Bible, out of New and Old Testament, it becomes rather ridiculous. It becomes rather difficult. I don't think anyone's home yet. I'm trying to do this before someone comes home again. I mean, the early church, really in the beginning, tried to figure out new and inventive ways. Yeah, they're home. I was hoping they have this done before they got home. And the early church really did spend a huge chunk of time how to get rid of the Jewishness from the Bible. Meanwhile, the Jewishness of the Bible is why you have one. That's why you have a Messiah who's a Jew. Why you have scriptures written by Jews. You cannot have Christianity without Jewishness. It is not possible. There's no such thing as a Gentile church. There's no such thing as a Jewish church. Anyway, but this book is very good. I mean, it's you get a lot of insights into their thinking. Some of it's misguided. Some of it's misguided. Some of it is just, we got to get rid of this Jewishness, so I'm going to write a way of getting rid of it. And that really is, look at the last 2,000 years of church history and tell me how getting rid of all that helped, let alone helped save Jews. It didn't. Another early book I read was this one. I like this book. This revised edition of the Standard History of the First Period in Christian Thought has been brought to you by Dr. Kelly. Organized as an ocean by material, blah, blah, blah. And that's not what I wanted to read. But this book is a history of the first few hundred years of the church, of the doctrinal disputes, of the theological disputes, of the personalities who just either were pro or for Christianity or pro or for against paganism and philosophy and the rise of Mariolatry. And I mean, it is a good book. It is an excellent book on early doctrines, how they developed them, how they figured things out, how they came to their conclusions, right or wrong. It is an excellent book on certain personalities. It is a good book. I like this book. It is a very good book. I know I said not to interrupt me, but you never know. Another good book. This one. There's another book here too. This book is, let's see. Many Christians today long to become acquainted with their ancient ancestors in the faith. They see a deeper worship and devotion to prayers and hymns of the early church. And some are seeking help in reading scriptures from the early church fathers. But how and where do we begin? Our first encounter reading scriptures with the fathers may seem like visiting a far country, listening to the Bible study where the rules are different. The issues and conclusions are not the same. Well, they're not. I mean, a lot of the early fathers really disagreed with each other a lot. I mean, they tried to get to the right conclusions to what they were trying to debate, but they really kind of created their own problems. Mainly because they were so busy getting in their own way, like most people. In reading scriptures from the church fathers, Christopher Hall introduces us to the fathers, their world, and the insights and sounds they perceived in the Bible. As Hall points out, the fathers hear music in scripture where we remain tone deaf, despite their occasional idiosyncrasies. Their hearings of refining through long distance. This is why I do not like talking and reading out loud, people. This is why I'm a writer, not a talker. Despite their occasional eccentricities, theirs is a hearing refined through long listening to the music of scripture in song, worship, teaching, meditation, and oral reading. And like true masters, they challenged and correct our modern assumptions as they invite us to tune in our ears to hear the divine melodies. Reading scripture with the church fathers is an exceptional guide. It is warm. It is a very good book. I mean, it does talk about the Eastern Fathers and the Western Fathers. The Western Fathers was the Latin Church. The church that was in Rome, who spoke Latin. The Eastern Church was the Greek Orthodox Church. The Byzantium Church, if you want, or the Eastern Empire's Roman Empire. Once the Western half fell, the Byzantiums were the only ones left. But they carried on the traditions of the Roman Empire. This does talk about the church fathers of that period. It is fascinating. It talks about why are we reading the fathers, the modern mind and biblical interpretation, who are the fathers, the four doctors of the East, Athenaeus, Gregory, and Nesernus, Basil the Great, and John Chrysostom. Why can't these people have normal names like John, David, Peter? Anyway, the fathers in Scripture, Exegesis of Alexandria, the fathers in Scripture is the response of Antioch, making sense of patristic. As I know I'm saying this word wrong, and I believe it's when you look at Scripture and you let Scripture tell you what it says instead of you tell you what the Scriptures say. I know there's two different words. I should have written this down, but there is a word that does it, and then there's another word that's like that is the opposite. You are telling the Scriptures what they say, and that's one of the biggest problems with studying the Bible with theology. Is a lot of them were telling the Scriptures what they were saying instead of the other way around. But this book is very good. It does talk about, let's see. It talks about Origen, who, by the way, was a heretic. Okay, I don't care what you tell me. The man wrote and sounded like a Jehovah's Witness. And he's probably more closer to their doctrines than actual biblical Orthodox Christianity. It talks about why there was a council of Nicaea. It talks about the Arians, and he talks about a lot of. It's a very good book of early church history, of the battles and the conflicts people had with each other and over the Scriptures, and it is good. I will probably talk about it again later, but this is just a brief introduction to this concept. Learning theology with the Church Fathers. The early Church Fathers were great theologians. I'll give them that. Though they did not think of themselves as such, they were working pastors involved in the daily life and the leadership of their congregations. Yet they were wrestling with some of the great formative questions of the Christian faith, such as the Trinity, the Incarnation, the promise of God, and the nature of the Church. These beliefs were defined as the crucible of spiritual leadership, pastoral care, theological conflicts, all set against the background of the great cultural movements and events of their day. For the Fathers, theology was a spiritual exercise woven into the texture of life. What would it be like to sit under the preaching and instructions of these great men, to look over their shoulders as they thought and wrote, or to hear them debate the theological issues? I'll try to say that 3 times fast. Learning theology with the Church Fathers replicates the experience for us. With the same insights and love of the subject that he brought for the last book I mentioned, Christopher Hall takes us into the world of patristic, basically fathers. Actually, one of these 2 books talks about the church mothers too. I forget which one it is, but one of them actually does. One of them does actually talk about the history of women in the Bible, women in church history doing a lot of interesting things. So there were church mothers, there were just fathers, but one of these books talks about that. But it's quite interesting, actually. If you want to, these 3 books I would start with. If you want to just get an idea of why a Bible study is important, why theology is important, why church history is important, which is another thing I'm going to get into, and I'm going to try to be a little clearer on these things, particularly on the 2 words I know I'm getting wrong, at least how to say them anyway, because they sound very similar, they look very similar. But see, I think a Bible study is important. I think theology is important. I think just wanting to have an understanding of church history is important, which I think the modern church, it seems to be avoiding at all costs. I think most modern Christians are not interested in where their theology came from. No, not really. Jesus said it, or Paul said it, or Peter said it, or John said it. But where did it come from them? Why was it there? What is the 5 W's of all this? Why, where, when, who, why, and how? How does it belong there, David? Sure. Yep, I'm sure. Yes, and there is rum in here. I haven't had rum all week. I only have rum once a week, people. But this book is good. This book really goes into details of things. I'm at 15 minutes, so I'm gonna stop. So I don't want to go over 15 minutes. I know I abruptly stop these things, but I like to keep them short. That way, people don't have to feel like they have to sit around for a long time. So I'm gonna try to do. But next one will be on the same thing again, because I think this is an interesting subject, and I think I finally figured out what I'm trying to do with this particular part of my YouTube channel when it comes to the Bible and comes to the church. So hopefully I haven't bored too many people with my ramblings. Well, people, behave yourselves. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Behave yourselves. You know I'm not going to. I don't know how. Later.